And almost immediately after the hostages were taken in Iran, and I had a copy of the Arabia Desiderata in the first edition, and this man called me up and he said, "I want to come alone, can you stay there?" So I stayed after it closed, and this young man showed up, and he was an Iranian, and he was a businessman in Charleston, but he had closed his business, and he wanted the book, and I told him how much it was worth, and he gave me the money, and he says, "I thank you very much for waiting for me. I was afraid to come." And I've never forgotten that, because he was having a hard time in his own city because everybody knew he was an Iranian. It's very sad.
Yes, and this is where we want to embrace our own histories and roots so that we understand that whether you are from a foreign nation or from a different part of the United States of America, from the north, from the south, from the west, or a different color or creed or faith, that basically we are mostly more similar than we are different. And our concerns are often identical. Those who faced the worst in terms of discrimination during times of revolution, particularly right now, of course, relations between the United States and Iran are very strained, very stressed, very unsteady. And this is where the voice of reason needs to come through. This is where leadership needs to make its words known appropriately. This is where communication, the reason we're sitting in this beautiful bookstore, the Annapolis bookstore on Maryland Avenue, alone, that speaks volumes. A stone's throw from here were revolutionaries who were writing poetry and writing declarations of independence. And there were real consequences to people who live within blocks of here, where those who stood up for the American Revolution had their families killed. So the consequences of the fight for freedom, the fight for democracy in the world are very serious.
While we're on that subject, this book of poetry that I believe it came out in 2003, Mending
Nations.
Now, this is about that theme, isn't it? About
Yes, it is. And this is why when I work with Miriam Chavez, the daughter-in-law of labor leader Cesar Chavez, who was fighting for a different cause, but who was trying to have people understand, the United Farm Workers. And Robert Kennedy at that time took a big political chance by going out and associating himself with Cesar Chavez, and then that Life magazine front cover picture. And then it forever moved the United States. And then also our communications with the Soviet Union and Russia as an old country, a new nation, very important. And so Mending Nations has a lot of stories, poetry, and the reason why I feel poetry is so important, I think today people sometimes think of poetry as a choice or an aesthetic. But I think what young students, I taught the gifted and talented students in the 7th grade at the Southern Middle School a few years ago, and I tried to explain to them that poetry was often the only safe form of expression, and that during times of highly sensitive political rebellion, it was the poet who could actually come closest to saying the truth. Because if you give a person a list of facts, this is what happened in this order, that's one way of looking at something. But what the poet does is they counterpoint things, they analyze, they evaluate, they assess, they interpret for you, they editorialize, and they try to put in perspective the meaning and the function of what is going on and and paint a picture of what this will lead to. So you have, our great epic poets like Homer, who will tell about wars, about the coming, the journeys coming and going, and how civilizations developed. And you have in all revolutions throughout the world the poets who tell the story first. It's very difficult to give, like Shakespeare does in many of his tragedies, to give lists of these tragic things happen, like a newsreel. But it's easier to give those masks of war, the masks of humor, the masks of love, the masks of hate, to, as a human being, as you read them or see them enacted in a play, somehow you're able to absorb it better. And you actually, I think it's often a call to action, because somehow it lays on your heart as truer than the facts. And this is why it's important to share poetry with youth, I believe.
That was it was a wonderful thing you did to teach that. I taught poetry in the schools for 7 years, all the way from primary grades up through high school. And when they're very young, they're so open, and the things they express, they haven't been ruined, they're innocent. And surprising what good poetry they write.
Oh, yes.
Luckily, I believe that right now poetry is on the ascent again. So
Definitely. And I think programs like this, accentuating the interpretation of literature, because literature is an opportunity to, it's a discussion point. It's wisdom. But wisdom is of itself is still static. What happens when people discuss poetry is it deepens the richness of the understanding of the wisdom. And that's what actually leads to a changed mind, a transformed heart, a reconciled.
Do you think of yourself more as a poet or more as a novelist or a screenwriter? You had mentioned you have a film that went to Sundance also.
Yes.
So where if you're labeling yourself or something, but what you are, Lailee, how do you?
I think I consider myself a storyteller. I think a storyteller. I think when I was young, I grew up, my mother spoke Farsi, and many visitors came to the home. It was a very multicultural home. I remember one amusing story one day.
This was where now?
This is in Chevy Chase, Maryland, suburb of Washington, D.C. And there were I had 5 brothers, so there were 6 children. And one day my mother made a large breakfast, every breakfast was large, and my father was home a little bit later than usual, going to work, and one of our many house guests was at the table. He was Armenian. And my father had this wonderful conversation with him, and he said, well, now, how long have you been in the United States? He said, 6 months, Mr. McNair, and he said, that's wonderful, and where have you been staying these 6 months? And he said, well, Mr. McNair, I've been staying upstairs in your house. And he didn't realize. But my mother had travelers from around the world, and they would stay for 6 months. So as children, we would incorporate their stories as part of our
your
lives.
mother's a painter who's done the covers for these books?
Yes, my mother's an amazing artist.
Well, I have a question. I remember talking with your mom one time, or when you were talking about walking when you first came to Chevy Chase, and walking with. Do you remember that story? Did you tell me that, or did your mother? I'm pointing here because Lailee's mom's here in the audience tonight. But walking, and you had a stick that you were walking. Describe.
Yes.
And how old were you then?
We were probably around, the first 4 of us were stair-step children, so we were probably 6, 5, 4, and 2.5, or 3. And we had no accoutrements. There were no strollers. There was no accoutrements. But we would walk, Persians walk. But the first thing we would have to do is find a good, strong stick. My mother said, find a stick. And all 4 of us would be looking for a strong limb, a stick. It was like the staff of a shepherd, because my mother was raised in Masjid Suleiman with the nomads. And so we would find the stick, and then she would tell us about the nomadic journey. And we would be walking on summer nights and hearing
Through
all
streets
the
of Silver
tales,
Spring, or Chevy Chase,
Chevy Chase,
yeah.
barefoot, and which you wouldn't think of having children barefoot today, nor would I, but we were barefoot and we were carrying our staffs and we were looking for lions, you know, and you had to be strong, and we were very playful, adventurous, and imaginative. And my mother believed that that beautiful natural environmental world existed everywhere. It wasn't just in Africa or Persia. It was every bit as intense, the native plants of the Chesapeake Bay estuary. I mean, so we've been taught to seek adventure and seek magic and playfulness. And we all became very competitive. My brother became #1 in the world in tennis. My other brother became a Harvard scholar, and all of us, and none of us went to preschool.
Lailee, I hate to stop you here. We're going to have to continue this again someday soon. You must promise to do that with me.
I promise.
But I want to thank you very much for being here this evening.
Thank you for having me at the
Thank you,
Annapolis
Lailee.
bookstore. I appreciate it.